So we're going to finish up today with looking at how skeletal muscles use ATP and the different processes that they undergo to generate ATP for muscle contraction of varying lengths of time. So when we look back on what we just talked about with chapter 26, where does the ATP for muscle contraction come from? We know that a big portion of the ATP comes from the mitochondria. So what processes would those be? So you got the membrane reactions, which are electron transport chain, and the oxidative phosphorylation. There is a difference. Electron transport is just the movement of those electrons down the cytochromes. And in the process, the energy is used to move the protons to the inner membrane space, right? Oxidative phosphorylation, then, is where those protons diffuse from that inner membrane through the ATP synthase into the matrix. And in the process, generate ATP. That's oxidative phosphorylation. So the majority of the ATP comes from there. Where else do we get ATP from? Glycolysis. Well, we're going to see today that there is a couple of other processes, in addition to what we've already talked about, that will provide energy for skeletal muscles for their contraction. And when we look at how skeletal muscles use the energy and the type of where energy comes from, we classify this energy according to the amount of time that it takes for the specific activity based on time. So we have immediate energy, short-term energy, and long-term energy. Now, just to kind of refresh your memory, why do we need ATP for muscle contraction? There's two functions of ATP during cross-bridge cycling. The first one was what? Breaks the cross bridge. If you don't know what a cross bridge is, you're going to have to look it up. Second function of ATP during cross bridge cycling was to reposition that myosin head into that high power position. So here's the low power position. When the ATP is hydrolyzed, it releases energy and moves that myosin head into that high power position. Now there's another function of ATP, not related to cross-bridge cycling, but important for the relaxation process. What was that? Those calcium pumps that pumps the calcium from the sarcoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We're not going to concern ourselves with that so much. We're more concerned about the ATP that's necessary for the breaking of the cross-bridge and repositioning of those myosin heads. So we'll start first by looking at immediate energy, meaning that the energy is used immediately. And when we say immediately, we're talking in doing exercises or activities up to about 10 seconds of time. Now, these numbers are not set in stone, but these numbers kind of relate to someone that's in pretty good physical condition. So what types of exercises, what types of activities using and involving skeletal muscles would require about 10 seconds or up to 10 seconds, do you think? Okay, short flight of steps. What else? Think of the different sports and activities that you do. a sprint, a very short sprint, like to first base, if you're baseball or softball. Maybe a 50-meter sprint in a track meet. Swinging a golf club or a bat. Tennis racket. Of course, there is some endurance that you need for tennis as well. Bowling. Weightlifting. So we're talking upwards of 10 seconds, maybe less. Now, if you're doing one of these, and there are others, there are some different mechanisms that your cells use before they start relying on glycolysis and then aerobic respiration. Remember, in skeletal muscle, we have a pigment called myoglobin. And we know that myoglobin stores oxygen. Stores oxygen within the cell. Myoglobin is, in a way, you can look at it as a cousin to hemoglobin. Doesn't store a lot of oxygen, but it stores enough oxygen to allow for a small amount of aerobic respiration. So that stored oxygen is able to allow aerobic respiration to occur. So for this period of time, maybe about 5 seconds, roughly, we're able to undergo glycolysis and then aerobic respiration. Or maybe even beta oxidation and then the aerobic respiration. So that's upwards of 5 seconds. Now we have another 5 seconds we need to account for. And that's where this phosphagen system comes in. This phosphagen system involves a series of enzymes that are basically transferring a phosphate from one molecule to an ADP. And if we have an ADP, there's our adenosine molecule. Here's our 2-phosphate, so that's ADP. If we add another phosphate to ADP, what do we get? ATP. So we're taking a high-energy phosphate or a phosphate from one low-energy molecule, and the enzyme is going to transfer that phosphate and add it to ADP, making it a high-energy molecule. The first enzyme is called myokinase. Myo meaning muscle, kinase meaning the transfer of phosphates. So the myokinase mechanism is going to take a phosphate from an ADP and hand it off to another ADP, thereby making ATP and adenosine monophosphate. Let me diagram it out for you real quick. So there's our adenosine, here's our phosphate. So here's our 2 ATP molecules. The myokinase is going to cleave off one of these phosphates, add it to the second ADP. This now becomes AMP, adenosine monophosphate. And this now becomes what? Adenosine triphosphate. So if we look at the amount of matter that we have at the beginning compared to the matter we have at the end, we have the same. We still have 3 phosphates and 2 adenosines. So the amount of matter is the same. We've just changed it around to create a high-energy molecule in the form of ATP. So basically what's happening is that this phosphate is doing that. And this then is left, we're left with AMP. Now at the same time, there's another process that can happen that can generate ATP as well. And this is the creatine phosphate system. We have a molecule stored in our muscle cells called creatine phosphate. It's the same creatine that people take as powder and mix it in drinks and drink it before they go exercising and lifting weights. This creatine stores phosphates, basically. It's a phosphate-storing molecule. And this enzyme, creatine kinase, again, we see that kinase, phosphate transfer. That creatine kinase is going to take the phosphate from the creatine, add it to the ADP, and so now we're left with ATP and creatine. Oops. Same idea as we saw before. So here's our creatine phosphate. Here's our ADP. The enzyme is going to take this phosphate off, add it here, and what we're left with then is ATP. And what do we get when the phosphate comes off of this one? Just creatine. So the amount of matter that we started with is the same. If we had to write a balanced chemical equation, we could. We have the same amount of matter on both sides of the equations. So that will also then provide some additional ATP for muscle contraction. Doesn't require oxygen, doesn't require glucose or any other fuel source. These high energy bonds are already stored. Where do you think this ADP comes from? Or this ADP? It's going to come from the hydrolysis of ATP that's occurring during crossbred cycling. As the crossbred cycling is occurring and ATP is broken down to release the energy to reposition that myosin head, there's going to be ADPs left over and phosphates, but the ADPs are what are going to be used to make more ATP for these processes. So collectively, these two give about another 5 seconds worth of time for this particular exercise. Now, let's say you get done, doing your 50-meter sprint in 9 seconds or 40, whatever you did. At rest, your body is then going to regenerate the creatine phosphate. Where do you think the phosphate's going to come from? So ATP at rest will give up a phosphate to the creatine phosphate to make creatine phosphate. At rest, we can use aerobic respiration. Actually, at rest, most of our skeletal muscle utilize fatty acids and beta oxidation to generate ATP. This is skeletal muscle. So at rest, our bodies are undergoing beta oxidation. We're breathing in oxygen. That oxygen is able to facilitate the citric acid cycle and electron transport to allow ATP to be produced so that we can regenerate that creatine phosphate, and to allow us to regenerate ADP so that we can make more ATP as well. During that particular exercise, our body doesn't have time to bring in the oxygen necessary to generate lots of ATP. So there's this backup system. And in fact, this backup system is going to be the first system used regardless of whatever type of exercise you're doing. Whether you're doing immediate energy, like swinging a golf club, whether you are running a 400-meter sprint, which is once around a track, which is going to take longer, or whether you are running 5 miles. Your skeletal muscle cells are going to start with the myoglobin and with the phosphagen system first, always. Okay, short-term energy. This would be up to about 40 seconds. Exercises that or activities that are taking upwards of 40 seconds. So we're talking running up and down a basketball court. You know, you hit a home run and you're running around all four bases. You are doing a 100-meter swim. Or you're running a 200 or 400-meter sprint. These types of exercises are more power and endurance, whereas the immediate exercises are more power, strength and power. This is power and endurance. These are the folks that need a lot of cross-training, that not only do they need to build up their muscles for strength, but they need to build up their endurance as well. So in this type of exercise, the first thing that's going to be used would be the myoglobin. It's going to give you what I said, about 5 seconds. The oxygen from myoglobin anyway. And then you have the phosphagen system. That's another 5 seconds. So that's our first 10 seconds. That's no different than what we saw before. Now at this point, this is where glycolysis kicks in. And your cells are going to rely on stored, keep in mind we're talking skeletal muscle here. We're talking stored glycogen. So that glycogen phosphorylase molecule will cut off a glucose from the glycogen, add a phosphate. Remember, it becomes glucose 1-phosphate, and then it enters into the glycolysis cycle. We talked about that the other day. How much ATP are we going to get from glycolysis per glucose molecule? From glycolysis? Net 2. That's important. Net 2. And you got to be careful when you read the questions in the exam, because I will use the specific terms: glycolysis, matrix reaction, citric acid cycle, oxidation of pyruvic acid, membrane reactions, oxidative phosphorylation, electron transport. You need to know the differences and the relationships between those terms. Glycolysis will give us a net 2 ATP. Now, what process allows glycolysis to continue in anaerobic conditions? This is the same process that allows NAD to continue to be replenished to allow glycolysis to continue, and that was the lactic acid fermentation. Now, collectively, these two give us about another 30 seconds or so. These numbers aren't set in stone, as I said. So there's our 40 seconds. Now this is all important because, as I said, we're going to go through all of these before we get to the aerobic respiration part, and that's what we'll talk about next. But these steps are important because they allow the body time to actually reach what's called a steady state. And the steady state refers to when your body is bringing in a consistent amount of oxygen at a consistent rate that can then be used for aerobic respiration. when you start running, those proprioceptors in your joints and in your muscles are sending signals to the brain, and the brain is then sending signals to the brain stem saying, oh, we're getting a lot more activity. We need to prepare the muscles and the body so they can get more oxygen. And so that starts to then change the breathing rate. And so you're breathing more. It increases the heart rate. Heart rate goes up. Blood starts being circulated faster to the muscles.
You said time allows them to get to a steady state for aerobic respiration.
A steady state refers to the amount of oxygen coming in. So, yeah. So these 40 seconds, minute or so of time are important because it allows the body to reach the steady state that's then going to be able to support aerobic respiration. Oops. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about long-term energy. We're talking about endurance. Not power and endurance, just endurance. Being able to sustain an activity or exercise for a long period of time. Beyond the 40 seconds. So these would include, distance running. Bless you. Distance biking, distance swimming. Swimming a 500-meter swim or a 1,000-meter swim. It's a different kind of endurance. She said raising kids. That's a different kind of endurance. Yes, you need some physical endurance for that as well. But I think most of it's up here, I'm learning. So, like we saw before, we start with myoglobin. If I'm gonna go out and run 5 miles right now, just follow me with an ambulance. We start with the myoglobin and the stored oxygen. And then we use the phosphagen system. And we use the glycogen lactic acid system. That would be the glycolysis and lactic acid fermentation I mentioned. And then we get into aerobic respiration, which would include the matrix reactions, which remember include the oxidation of pyruvic acid, where it goes from pyruvic acid to acetic acid. Remember that? Then it becomes acetyl-CoA. Then acetyl-CoA goes into the citric acid cycle. So these two, when I talk about matrix reactions, you should immediately think about oxidation of pyruvic acid and the citric acid cycle. And then, of course, we have the membrane reactions, which include 2 parts, and those would be, I already mentioned them, electron transport chain, or electron transport system, and oxidative phosphorylation. How much ATP do we get per glucose molecule from glycolysis? Net 2. How much ATP do we get directly from the matrix reactions? Per glucose. ATP. 2 ATP per glucose. But we also get 8 NADH from the matrix reactions and 2 FADH2s. Remember? These then, the energy in those, remember, is used in electron transport, and that pumps those hydrogen ions against the gradient into the inner membrane space. Trying to help you review a little bit too. So how much ATP are we going to get between these 8 and 2 here? 8 times 3 is 24, plus 2 times 2, so we're going to get 28, right? But we also have 2 NADHs from up here, and that's another 4. No, sorry, another 6. So now we're going to get 34 ATP. And obviously then protons come back through that pump and we generate ATP. So these long-term energy, the difference then is that now we are able to use aerobic respiration, we're able to use the matrix and membrane reactions to generate large quantities of ATP that can sustain muscle contraction for longer periods of time. Now obviously if you compared the amount of endurance I have compared to someone who runs 5 miles or 10 miles a day, obviously the person that runs 10 miles a day is going to have a lot better endurance and is going to be able to maintain this aerobic respiration for longer periods of time. Obviously, I wouldn't. That's where training and conditioning comes in. It changes the anatomy of the muscle cells. It adds more enzymes. We'll get into this in a few minutes. But it changes the physical structure of the cells that then allow them to use ATP more efficiently, to be able to make more ATP so that they can sustain this particular exercise or activity longer. All right, so this is just kind of a summary. Okay, we don't store ATP. I haven't modified this slide yet, but there may be a little bit of ATP that had just been made that can be used. That's part of that 5 seconds. And then we throw in the phosphagen system. That gives us upwards of 10 seconds. This is kind of cumulative, each line here. We go in the, oh, those are reversed. We need to really edit this slide. Glycogen lactic acid system, that's upwards of 40 seconds. And then this is roughly beyond 40 seconds. Now, it may take me as an unfit individual, not as unfit as I make it sound, but this may take me as a relatively not as fit individual as I should be, more than 40 seconds. It might be, this system here, it might take me upwards of 90 seconds or longer before I reach that steady state. That's the other thing that happens during physical conditioning, is that you can reach that steady state faster, meaning that your body is able to bring in the oxygen necessary for aerobic respiration sooner rather than later. So, this 40 seconds here, 45 seconds, minute, is where you reach steady state. Okay, this is from your book. This is just kind of a graphical representation of what we've just talked about. So upwards of 10 seconds, we're relying on the phosphagen system. Up to 40 seconds or so, we're using the glycogen lactic acid system. And then beyond that, eventually we reach the point where we can use aerobic respiration. But when we get done, we actually have a little bit of debt to pay off because of what happened here. Basically what happened is we got a loan. That's where the term, and oxygen debt is an old term. It's really not used anymore, but it's a good analogy to use. We got a loan to sustain us until we got to this point. Now we have to pay that loan back. And that's what happens in recovery. Is that you're paying back this loan, this energy that you had to borrow to get to that steady state. And we'll talk about that in a minute. This one you can skip. It's just kind of the same thing, just looking at different types of exercises and activities and the amount of time it takes. So strength and power, along with sustained power, would be that immediate energy. And then you have anaerobic power and endurance, and then you have